Juan always dreamed of a simple life, far from violence and war. He was a peasant, living with his family on a small farm in rural Mexico. But fate has its own plans, and one night, everything changes. The CJNG cartel, one of the most powerful and ruthless in the country, invades his small community, destroying everything he knew. Juan is forced to make a decision that will lead him down a path of no return. What would he do? Would he fight for his survival, even if it meant losing himself in the process? If you're curious to find out how Juan's story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comments. What would you do in his place? Comment below and share your opinion. The dirt road cut through the arid landscape, the sun's heat reflecting off the dry Mexican earth. Amidst the solitude, a lone farmer, Juan, walked with a worried expression on his face, dust rising with each step. He was on his way to his small farm, where his wife and children awaited him, but something troubled him. The air seemed thick, and a strange feeling haunted him. However, what he didn't know was that his life was about to change irreversibly. As he approached a bend in the road, 4 vehicles stopped in front of him, raising a cloud of dust. Armed men got out of one of the cars with hard, menacing stares. Juan remained silent, but felt the weight of the situation. It was the CJNG, the most feared cartel in the region, known for its violence and brutality. The men surrounded him, questioning him firmly about his identity and his dealings in those lands. Juan tried to remain calm, but a slight tension in his body betrayed his nervousness. They began to search him mercilessly, but Juan knew what was behind this approach. The cartel needed information, and he seemed the perfect target. What the group didn't know was that the simple peasant they were interrogating wasn't just any farm worker. Juan wasn't merely a man who cultivated the land to support his family. He was a retired Mexican army commander who had served on secret missions and in bloody battles throughout the country. His ability to handle extreme situations was far beyond the comprehension of those men. While the cartel men continued to question him, Juan felt the weight of his experience, and a part of him knew that soon the situation would take another turn. He had distanced himself from the army, seeking the peace that a simple life could offer, but fate seemed determined to pull him back into war. Juan watched the cartel men closely, trying to gauge their intentions. They were young, but the hardness in their eyes indicated they had lived more than their age suggested. The leader, a tall man with tattoos covering his arms, approached and stared at him with a cold expression, as if weighing the value of his life. "Are you going to give us information, or are we going to have to take it by force?" the leader said, his voice harsh. But contrary to what the cartel expected, Juan was not intimidated. He knew how to handle this kind of pressure. He had trained for it during years of service in the army, far from his family, far from his homeland. The weight of the decision to leave military life still haunted him, but now his experience did not allow him to waver. While the leader continued to pressure him, Juan analyzed the situation. The parked cars, the armed men, the lonely road, it all seemed so familiar. It was as if he were back on the battlefield, but with a new enemy. The CJNG cartel was dangerous, but Juan had something they didn't expect. A strategic mind, forged in years of combat. But his story didn't begin on the dusty streets of Mexico. Before becoming a farmer, Juan was a respected commander in the Mexican Army's Special Forces. A commander of covert operations, he was known for his skill in planning and executing high-risk missions. He had served alongside some of the country's best soldiers in operations ranging from combating drug trafficking to hostage rescue missions. But after losing several friends in battle, he decided his life of war had to end. He retired to a simpler life, hoping to find the peace he had always dreamed of. On the small farm, he started a new life with his wife Maria and their children, trying to stay away from the shadows of the past. However, the weight of the war never left him, and the peace he so longed for always seemed within reach, but never truly achieved. Now, confronted by the cartel, he knew his old life had caught up with him again. The cartel men closed in even more, but something changed in Juan's expression. He felt he was about to make a crucial choice: stay and submit, or take control of the situation, as he had always done on the battlefield. The cartel leader continued to press, his eyes fixed on Juan. "You have a chance to cooperate now, but it won't be for long," he said with a coldness that cut through the air. However, Juan's silence seemed to defy his words. The peasant was not the ordinary man he had imagined. "I don't know anything," Juan replied calmly, trying to hide the tension that was beginning to grow inside him. He knew that the key to survival would be to keep his emotions under control. The cartel leader approached, narrowing his eyes as if trying to read every movement of the man in front of him. But before any action could be taken, a shouting match began in the distance. One of the cartel men raised his head, alerting the others. The sound of motorcycle engines was rapidly approaching, and the sight of several shadows approaching down the road indicated that someone was coming. The cartel leader turned, his expression altered. He already knew that whatever was approaching was not something he could control. "Get ready," he ordered urgently. The men grabbed their weapons, ready to react, but they didn't know what to expect. Juan knew this was no coincidence. During his time in the army, he had learned to identify when something was about to happen, and this movement was no ordinary occurrence. It was a threat. While the cartel men positioned themselves to confront the potential threat, Juan stood still, studying the situation. He couldn't wait much longer. The opportunity to seize control was opening up, but the tension in his body made him uncomfortable. He was used to acting under pressure, but now his family's life was at stake. On the other side of the road, a group of motorcyclists appeared, hooded and armed. Juan recognized the motorcycles and the fighting style immediately. It was the Mexican army, but not the army he knew. They were renegade soldiers, those who had distanced themselves from the armed forces like him, but with a different objective. They were a clandestine cell, a secret operations unit that worked outside the laws of the country. The motorcyclists stopped abruptly, and the cartel men tensed, unsure of what their next move would be. The cartel leader looked at Juan, as if searching for answers, but he knew it wouldn't be Juan who would save him now. Juan then made a decision. He had faced more complicated situations before, but none like this one. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in his mind. He was facing an endless war, where the armies of his past clashed with the present, and the future of his family depended on the path he would choose. "If I survive this, I'll never have a normal life again," Juan thought, as he watched the motorcyclists get even closer. The battle was about to begin, and he knew the next few minutes would be crucial. The tension on the road was palpable. The group of hooded motorcyclists drew closer, but Juan knew that not all of them were enemies. He sensed that some of the men among them were like him, ex-military men, fighting against a corrupt and soulless system. The cartel and the renegades were two sides of the same coin, but their loyalty wasn't based solely on power or money. There was something more, something personal. While the CJNG men prepared for the imminent battle, Juan thought of his wife, Maria, and the children who were at home, unaware of what was happening. The last time he saw them, he was leaving the farm in search of some kind of peace. He thought the war was already behind them, but fate, as always, had other plans. The cartel leader, who now seemed even more impatient, looked at Juan suspiciously. "Who are they?" he asked, trying to understand what was happening. Juan, remaining calm, knew he couldn't simply tell the truth. Not at that moment. "Mexican army," he replied, in a tone of voice that didn't betray the threat he himself felt. The response caused a momentary pause. The cartel leader took a step back, assessing Juan's answer. He knew the man before him had something more to hide. But Juan wouldn't be manipulated. The battle wasn't just about who was on the road, but about what was at stake: his freedom, his family, and his honor. Meanwhile, the group of motorcyclists continued to advance, their engines roaring like a growing threat. Juan knew he couldn't wait any longer. The time to act had come. The cartel leader, now more apprehensive, looked at the other men and signaled for them to prepare for the confrontation. The atmosphere was tense and battle seemed imminent. But Juan, with a furtive glance, noticed something the others hadn't, a slight movement among the motorcyclists. He saw an older man, with a serious and determined expression, calmly observing the situation. He seemed more than just a former soldier. He was someone high-ranking, with experience Juan knew well. The older man, perhaps a renegade commander like himself, looked directly at Juan and, in a discreet gesture, gave a sign of recognition. Juan knew immediately who he was. He wasn't just a soldier who had abandoned the war. He was a man who was now involved in something much bigger than a simple battle between cartels and armies. The situation was becoming even more complicated. Juan knew that loyalty in the end would be a matter of survival. The choices he would make in the coming moments would not only be about his safety, but about which side he would choose to defend what little remained of his honor and dignity. As the silence stretched on, the only thing Juan was sure of was that regardless of what happened, he would no longer be the simple peasant he once thought he would be. He was no longer running from the war. The war, somehow, had already found him. The silence on the road stretched for a moment, but was broken by the growing sound of the motorcycles, which were now so close that the noise seemed deafening. The cartel men were tense, their hands firmly gripping their weapons, ready for any movement that might arise. But Juan knew that the real threat wasn't the motorcycles themselves, but what lurked behind them. The cartel leader looked at the others, awaiting a command to attack, but something inside him felt disconnected. He sensed the situation was out of control, as if a greater force was approaching, and in fact, it was. The next instant, one of the bikers, the oldest and most imposing, raised his hand. The gesture was simple, but charged with authority. The tension grew, but the bikers didn't move. That's when the truth was revealed in a brutal and unexpected way. The man who until then seemed to be a renegade commander, someone who looked familiar to Juan, stepped forward. He looked directly at the cartel leader and with frightening calm said, "I'm here to put an end to this." Before anyone could react, the commander made a swift gesture, and from within the crowd of motorcyclists, a small group of soldiers jumped off their bikes, armed to the teeth. The cartel leader, in shock, looked at Juan, who no longer hid his expression of recognition. The man before him was not just a renegade commander. He was someone from his past, someone with whom he had fought in secret battles and risky missions. But now he was there, on the other side of the line, leading a clandestine military force that no one would imagine existed. The commander signaled for the cartel soldiers to lower their weapons, but instead of obeying, one of the CJNG men stepped forward, attempting to fire his weapon. The sound of the shot was muffled by the roar of motorcycles and the ensuing chaos. Before the cartel leader could realize what was happening, the renegade soldiers began to move, advancing with precision and speed, taking down the cartel men with silent but lethal violence. Juan, with a swift and strategic movement, distanced himself from the group, seeking to position himself to better understand the situation. He didn't know whether he should get directly involved or wait. The conflict was now taking a different turn. His past as a commander was coming back to haunt him, and he was no longer sure which side he belonged to. But when the old commander looked directly at Juan, his eyes weren't filled with hostility. There was something more there, a kind of recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The commander gave a small nod, almost as if to say, "You know what to do." It was a difficult decision. Juan had to choose between following the old bonds of loyalty and justice or surrendering to the new reality of war and betrayal that surrounded him. He knew that by choosing a side, he would lose everything that remained of his simple life. But something inside him knew that, from that moment on, he would never be the same again. The confrontation on the road ended with disconcerting speed. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the air, but the tension had dissipated almost as quickly as it had begun. The cartel leader, now captured, had his hands tied, his gaze devoid of fury, but full of fear. He didn't understand what had just happened, nor how a simple peasant, whom he thought was an ordinary man, had become involved in that scene of violence. Juan watched from afar, his heart still racing. War had found him once more, but now he was no longer just a soldier or a peasant. He was part of something much bigger, something he could no longer control. Beside him, the renegade commander watched the cartel being neutralized with precision and coldness, the same man he had fought on the battlefields and who now stared at him as if expecting a response. Juan felt the weight of the decision. The choices he had made up to that point had a price, and he could already feel the repercussions forming around him. The old commander was not just a wartime ally. He was the key to a network of secret operations, a military cell that operated outside the rules of the government, the army, and the cartel itself. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" the commander said in a low voice, approaching Juan with a piercing gaze. Juan hesitated. He knew there was no turning back. "I had no choice. They were forcing me to do this." The commander nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. "You may think you still have a choice, but war never chooses who will fight for it. It only chooses who will live to see it." While the renegade soldiers were sorting through the cartel men, Juan felt a crushing weight on his shoulders. He had narrowly escaped that battle, but the war never stopped, and his position was now clearer than ever. He was no longer on the sidelines. He was a pawn in a power game far greater than he had imagined. The weakened cartel was being rapidly dismantled, and the few remaining members began to scatter. However, the leader, still bound, stared at Juan with a look of hatred and surprise. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how or why Juan had become part of this equation. "Do you really think this is going to end here?" the cartel leader grumbled. "They'll come after you. You just got into the game, and you can't get out now." Juan, though shaken by the cartel's words, already knew this. He knew that the choices he had made had put him on a path of no return. The simple life he had tried to build on the farm, with Maria and their children, now seemed like a distant dream, almost another life. The commander, seeing Juan's apprehension, spoke in a softer voice. "You may have left the army, but the army never left you. Not now." Juan looked at him, feeling the weight of reality settle in. The simple peasant he had been was gone. Now he was a marked man, forced to take part in something much bigger, something that challenged his morals and values. The consequences of his choice were only beginning. The cartel had been defeated, but the real enemy was lurking, and Juan knew that from now on, nothing would be simpler. The fight for survival now extended far beyond the borders of the road where it all began. Time passed quickly, and the life Juan had envisioned for himself, far from violence and war, dissipated like smoke in the wind. He now found himself immersed in a world he hadn't chosen, with decisions weighing more and more heavily on his shoulders. The renegade commander, now his ally, trained him in the shadows. The war never ended for those who, like Juan, had been scarred by the experience. The armies that had formed in his life were no longer composed solely of soldiers, but of men and women who lived for survival, whose sole objective was domination and control. Juan, no matter how hard he tried to distance himself, was pulled back to the center of it all. He realized too late that he could no longer hide from who he really was. No matter how much he tried to be a simple peasant, he was a commander, and his destiny was to fight. Over time, he began to realize the true complexity of his choice. He had distanced himself from the army, believing he could escape the weight of his former life. But in truth, he had never ceased to be the man who had led battles and covert operations. The war he tried to leave behind had not left him. With each mission he carried out with the commander and his men, Juan became more efficient, more cold. His strategic skills, honed in the army, made him one of the most valuable members of the clandestine cell. But with this transformation came a loss of his humanity, a feeling that he was losing something of himself. In his interactions with the commander and the other soldiers, Juan saw a growing difference. He felt the distance widening between him and those who had once shared the bonds of war with him. Now, he was caught between two worlds, the army he had left behind and the new reality he hadn't chosen, but which now dominated his life. On a quiet night, while reviewing plans for a critical mission, the commander approached him. "You're changing, Juan," he said in a deep voice. "You're becoming someone who can't go back." Juan looked at him, his eyes tired but resolute. He knew he had no choice anymore. He was no longer the man he once was, but he could no longer be the simple peasant he longed to be. He was someone new now, someone forged by battles, someone who would need to make decisions that could affect the fate of everyone around him. He felt, with increasing intensity each day, the weight of his transformation. With each mission, each new challenge, he was becoming a tougher version of himself. And worst of all, he knew that at some point, this would make him unrecognizable to the people he once loved and protected. But as much as this transformation frightened him, he also felt a growing strength within him, a force that propelled him forward. He had overcome the pain of loss, the pain of leaving the army, but now he faced something even more challenging. The loss of himself, the loss of the humanity he still tried to keep intact. War came in many forms, and he was beginning to understand that perhaps the greatest battle he would face would be against what he was becoming. The sun was beginning to set, tinging the sky a deep orange. The day's heat still lingered in the air, but the silence that had settled over the commander's base seemed denser than ever. Juan watched the horizon, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. The final mission lay before them, and he knew that regardless of what happened, it would change everything. The men he led now were not just his allies. They were the remnants of a renegade army, people with histories of pain and struggle like himself. Some of them, like him, had abandoned their families in search of something greater. Others had been forced to join the war, without choice, without destiny. But all were united now, as if the only thing that truly bound them was the need for survival. The commander, with a firm gaze, approached Juan. "The operation is simple, but don't underestimate the danger. You'll be at the center of it all. There's no turning back." Juan knew the mission wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about ensuring his loyalty was recognized and that he was no longer seen as a deserter. But that would require sacrifices. Sacrifices he wasn't sure he was willing to make. He thought of Maria and the children. He thought of everything he had sacrificed to become the man he was now. He knew that, by taking the next step, he could not turn back. The war had changed his soul, and he wondered if there was still any trace of the simple man who had once dreamed of a peaceful life. "Are you ready for what's coming?" the commander asked, as if he knew the answer. But Juan couldn't answer. There were no more words that could express what he felt. The mission was about to begin. The silence was broken by the sound of motorcycles preparing for the final move. Everyone was ready for the fight, but what no one knew was that the battle wouldn't just be against the enemy. It was an internal battle, where Juan would have to confront his own transformation. While the men prepared themselves, Juan stepped back a little, distancing himself from the mounting pressure. He looked once more at the road ahead, the road that would lead him back to the heart of the war. He knew that at that moment he was on the edge of a precipice. He was no longer the peasant. He was no longer the army commander. He was something different, something that could no longer be defined solely by a past that no longer existed. The operation was about to begin, and the question that still lingered in his mind was, How far would he be willing to go to ensure that in the end he won the war, or at least survived it? Night finally fell, and the stage was set for the final confrontation. Juan felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders, more than any mission he had faced in the past. The mission was no longer just about defeating an enemy. It was about the final fight for his own humanity, for his essence that, little by little, he felt slipping through his fingers. The plan was in motion. The motorcycles roared as the group advanced silently toward the cartel compound, now isolated and surrounded by rogue soldiers. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the universe itself were in suspense, awaiting the moment of decision. Juan led the way, his mind sharp as a blade, but his soul was troubled. He knew that by setting foot on that base, he would officially be in the game, irreversibly. There would be no turning back. Not anymore. War was on his mind, but he still questioned whether he could maintain his integrity intact in the end. The commander watched him from afar, his gaze leaving no doubt. "Now it's up to you," he whispered, before turning away to continue with his part of the operation. As Juan approached the compound, the sound of guns being cocked and the tension in the air indicated that the confrontation was about to begin. But he knew that the greatest enemy was not in the shadows ahead, but within himself. The cartel leader, now confined, stood in the center of the facility waiting. He no longer seemed like the feared man Juan had known. He seemed vulnerable. But that didn't lessen the threat he posed to Juan's peace. He knew that if he wanted to end all this, he would have to eliminate the problem at its root. With a speed that only his experience could provide, Juan stormed into the center, his hands firm on the trigger, his eyes alert to any movement. The operation was going according to plan, but something in the back of his mind stirred. It was then, in a moment of total clarity, that he saw the cartel leader, now cornered, looking directly at him. A cruel smile formed on the enemy's face, as if he knew something Juan didn't. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The atmosphere was so tense that even the wind seemed to have calmed, waiting for the final move. Juan approached. The silence in the air lingered. Then, with a calmness that defied the surrounding chaos, the cartel leader said, "You still don't understand, do you? This game doesn't end with your victory, Juan. You're part of it now. They're going to come after you. It's going to be a hunt. There is no victory for you." Juan's heart raced. The enemy's words were beginning to make sense, more than he cared to admit. The war would never end, and he was trapped in it forever. Before he could respond or make a final decision, the renegade soldiers advanced, neutralizing the last resistance. The cartel was finished, but the cost of this victory was yet to come. Juan, his eyes fixed on the defeated leader, realized that in eliminating the threat, he might have become the threat himself. There was no longer any distinction between him and the enemy, between those fighting for power and those fighting for survival. The blood he had spilled, the decisions he had made, all of that was now part of him. The moment the last bullet was fired and silence fell once more, Juan knew that however much he had defeated the cartel, he would never win his own inner war. The sun was already low on the horizon, tinging the sky red and orange, a silent reminder that the war would never end. The cartel compound, now in ruins, was silent. The weight of the battle, both physical and emotional, still hung in the air, but the mission was complete. The cartel leader was dead, his men defeated, and the rogue military cell that had once been his ally now dispersed, like a victorious squadron. But for Juan, victory meant no relief. He looked around, feeling a profound emptiness. The trees and mountains he once gazed upon with peasant eyes seemed so distant now. The simple man he once was no longer existed, and the transformation he had undergone had left him scarred, with wounds that would never fade. The commander approached, his expression serious. He knew what Juan was feeling. "You did what needed to be done. Now you can rest." But Juan didn't feel he could rest. He knew his soul was torn apart inside. Every action, every decision took him further away from who he truly wanted to be. Rest? Juan repeated almost mockingly. He didn't know what it meant anymore. What he had done hadn't justified his peace of mind. He had done what was necessary to survive, but the internal struggle continued. There was no rest for someone who found himself lost between two worlds. As the commander walked away, Juan approached the road, where the shadows of night began to lengthen. The war he thought he had left behind was with him all along. He looked at the horizon, now darker, and realized that his future would not be one of peace, but of constant vigilance. He could not escape the war, for it was within him, in every choice, in every step he took. But there was still something inside Juan that refused to give in completely. He had survived all of this, and somehow that still meant something. He turned to the men who were still around, some of them looking at him with respect, others with distrust. It didn't matter. What he did now was irrelevant to what he had become. The future was uncertain, but Juan knew that from now on he would live with the consequences of the choices he had made. The war would never leave him, but at least he still had his life. Even if it was marked by traumas he would have to carry forever. The struggle for survival didn't end with the victory of a battle. It continued in his mind, every day, with every breath. He looked once more at the road ahead. There was no turning back, but at least he was alive. Months had passed since the fall of the cartel and the dispersal of the renegade soldiers. Juan's world was no longer simple. He continued his life in a distant place, out of sight of those who knew him, but the echoes of war were still present. Sometimes he would find himself standing still, gazing at the horizon as he used to, but now something within him had changed forever. The man he once was, the simple farmer with his dreams and his family, seemed like a distant memory, almost like a dream that would never come true. Maria and the children had moved far away, and he knew he would never see them the same way again. He often wondered if he was still worthy of their love, if the person he had become would be recognized by them, but the answer didn't come. His life was now a road of choices, each one more difficult than the last. On a silent night, as the stars shone brightly above him, Juan heard a familiar sound, the roar of motorcycles. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew those men weren't just from the army or the cartel. They were ghosts from the past, and he was, in some way, a part of them. As the motorcycles drove away down the road, Juan stood there, his eyes fixed on the lights disappearing into the darkness. The war never ended, not for him. And so ends Juan's journey, a man divided between two worlds, marked by the war that never left him and by the internal struggle he can never completely overcome. But what about you, reader? What would you do if you were in his place? A life of war, difficult choices, and consequences that never disappear. How would you deal with it? If you were touched by this story, if Juan's internal struggles resonated with you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think happens to him after the last scene? Will he find a way to reconcile his past with his future, or will the war within him continue indefinitely? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories exploring the complexities of life and survival. Join us for more adventures full of twists and turns and unforgettable characters.